Hey guys, how's it going? It's like the gang's all here. Or at least most of the gang's here. All right, what we're gonna take a look at today is lesson 6. So this one, there's a couple of actually like some key things here that I thought worked really well. First off, we're gonna take a look this week at a little bit more with, last week we took a look at like importing an Illustrator file and kind of how you can like pull Illustrator files apart by object areas and start animating those. This week we're going to kind of do the same thing we're going to do with Photoshop. So we're going to take a look at a couple different things like animating a layered file, using this pick whip to copy animation styles. We're going to work with some imported Photoshop layer styles. We're going to do something called the track mat to adjust visibility. We're going to play around with this corner pin effect. And there's something that's in the lesson. It's called time remapping. I'm going to show you like a little demo of kind of like the general idea of it. I've never like used it. I've never found a reason to use it. It's just basically a way of like adjusting and slowing down frames or speeding up or repeating pieces of an animation. I've just never had a huge use for it. So I didn't necessarily like find a ton of help with it, but I'll show you guys just so that in the future you have that opportunity. And then after we're done with the lesson, we're gonna take a look at the second project, which is gonna be working with Kinetic type. I'm gonna have you guys create like a 30-second lyric video just so you get a chance to play around with some timing and sequencing issues that you may like run into. So this is really more about like syncing. I have a bunch of stuff up there. There's like some tutorial stuff, there's some walkthrough stuff, there's some suggestions. I found a couple of like really nice tools that'll help you as far as getting like songs or videos or anything that you want to work with. So this, as much as like this is a learning curve for like the software, this is kind of a cool way of kind of getting a chance to work with a little bit more timing specific stuff, especially when working with audio files. So first thing I want to do is I want to jump into Blackboard and show you guys what it is we're working with, and then we'll go from there. Again, as you got any questions, if you have any questions as we're working, please let me know. Fire them away, either shout them out or ask in the chat, and we'll kind of work from there. So there we go. All right, so just as a heads up, everything on the announcements page is as is. I'm trying to keep this as updated as possible. Remember, if you have not turned in the lesson 5 file or project 1, the title card, get those turned in for me. I do need to get grading done. Tomorrow I'm going to update everything and put in midterm grades. Keep in mind that midterm grades are going to be just a spot check. They're not your actual finished grade. They don't calculate towards it. It's just showing you where you're at as of this moment. So remember, in Blackboard, jump in, click on My Grades, check out the Grade Center, make sure you're caught up on everything, and if you're not, let me know. Okay, now, if you take a look underneath assignments this week, it's actually pretty straightforward. We're on lesson 6, it's animating layers. We just have this start file, and it's just a Photoshop file. It's just this guy right here, marquee.psd. What we're gonna do is something that looks like this. We're gonna play around with like flickering lights, and we're gonna do some masking stuff, and we got like this little pin effect that we're gonna do. So we're gonna play around with a couple different things. That's what this project's gonna look like. I'm gonna close this because we're gonna start all over from scratch here. So first thing I wanna do is dump all this stuff out of here. And I don't need any of this because we're gonna do it all over again. All right, now, what I want to do is I want to start off by, I'm just going to make a new project here. So I'm going to start with a new project, and what I want to do is I want to start by importing that PSD file. So this is just a straight up Photoshop file. It's built with some layers on it. So what we're going to do is we're going to first import this into our project and make sure we're importing it correctly so we can retain all that information. That's really kind of the big idea with what we did last week with Illustrator, and again this week with Photoshop, is that when we're pulling these things in, we want to see exactly like what's built in the file, not just one big flat image in the background. So I'm going to double click my project panel. It's going to pop open and it's going to ask me what it is I want to pull in. And here I found it on my desktop. Here's Marquee. I can import it as, and that's where I want to check. I want to do this as a composition and I want to retain my layer sizes. So I'm going to make sure I'm selecting that. I'm going to click open and it's going to ask me, do I want editable layer styles or do I want to merge them into footage? I want to make sure that I have editable layer styles. I want to be able to go in and adjust those things. So I'll click OK. There it is, and notice that I have a flat version and then I have this marquee layers, and it actually shows me all my layers and they're already named and kind of all ready to go. So nice part about that is I can actually like see what it is I'm working with. So what I want to do is I want to take a look at what's going on inside this composition. So I'm going to double click on marquee here, and it's actually going to load this all up as footage right in here. And when I double click this thing, it's going to reveal all the pieces to it. And I want to take a look at my composition settings. I want to take a look at my document size. I want to take a look at my length, all that. So if I go to composition, and then composition settings, it's going to show me how my file is actually built. So right now this thing is set up at 3645 pixels by 2510. It's kind of an off size. The aspect ratio is real weird. I'm not worried about it. I'm just going to leave it as is. For my frame rate, I'm going to set that to 29.97 seconds, so 30 frames per second, the standard. My resolution right now, it's set as half. I'm going to set this to full. And for my duration, I want to change how long this is. I want to make sure that this thing is set to 10 seconds. Yours might look a little different, but I want to just make sure it's right. And again, that's going to change everything on this composition. So I'm going to click OK. And before I go too far, what I want to do is I want to turn on my layers, and I want to just kind of check the eyeballs and see what all the different pieces are here. So it looks like I've got, I'll go from top to bottom. So I got a layer for that little starburst. I got my scrolling text here that's going to slide through. I've got that scroll area. It's like a box that it's going to sit in. I got the show title, so that's just like basically a big flat background area. I've got my lit up marquee, so it looks like I have a layer with the light bulbs off and with them on. And then I have the unlit marquee, and it looks like I don't really see what that is. I'd have to turn off all my other layers to see. So my unlit marquee, that's just my background. Got it. So I got a couple different pieces here that I'm going to work with. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start by playing around with some light changes. We're going to make it look like the marquee kind of like lights up and down. So we're going to use opacity and just some keyframing to animate that. So what I want to do is I'm going to go to the 4-second mark. So I'm going to scrub forward to 4 seconds. And what I'm going to do is I want to make sure that my lit marquee layer is selected. And that's this one. So it looks like it's on and off. Okay. So if it's off and on, there we go. All right. Now, at that 4-second mark, I'm going to press T because I want to see my opacity settings. Remember, you can always reveal all these by clicking and scrolling down, or if you just press the T, that reveals that. And what I want to do is I want to set a stopwatch. I'm going to set a keyframe here because I want this thing to fade into 100%. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to scroll back to the start, and I'm going to set my opacity to 0. So as this plays back, looks like my lights kind of warm up and flicker on by the time they get to the 4-second mark. Now, that's a pretty straightforward animation. We've done stuff like this before, and the file set up really nicely for us to do that. But what I want to do is I want to play around with duplicating that animation so that it applies to other pieces without having to do it all over again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll back to that start point to the beginning of the time ruler, and I'm going to expand this starburst layer. And then I want to expand its layer styles. It's got some layer styles applied to it. So I've got bevel and emboss turned on, and I'm going to expand that. So here it is. And it's showing me all the properties for a bevel and emboss. So all this stuff that's showing up, these are all the options. Like if you were in Photoshop and you did the FX button, these are all the different things you can change on it. What I want to do is I want to make sure the opacity is visible on that lit marquee, and I want to make sure I can see all of these things. So you may have to go in. If you take a look in this box, how it's got like a blue highlight around it, I'm going to expand this way up so I can see all the different parts. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this little pick whip here to copy all of the settings of this layer onto a different property within here. So again, with this all expanded out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick whip that depth down to my opacity layer. So I can click and drag it right down here. And notice that this depth now, it lights up in red and it resets. And there's this weird little, if I click on it, it shows this comp layer, lit marquee, transform. So it's showing that it's applying to it. And I'm going to change my depth value to my starburst layer. I'm going to change this to 150%. So now I'm going to collapse this down. I duplicated my settings. I'm going to collapse all this back so I can see everything. And now as I scroll forward, take a look. Now that glow also is kicking in as part of the depth effect on this layer here. So instead of repeating all those steps, I can just pick whip from one area to another to duplicate those settings. So far so good, that making sense? All right, now next thing we're gonna take a look at is, and I'm gonna collapse this because I'm done with that lit marquee for right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start animating this text. I got this text that kind of scrolls through here. I don't want this thing to just float across. I want to try and put this thing in that black box and make it look like it's just like an LED screen that's kind of scrolling through underneath it. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select my scroll text layer. If I check my eyeball on and off, I can see, yep, that's what I want to be working with. I'm going to go to my 4 minute and 10 second mark, or 4 second and 10 frame mark. So right there. And what I want to do is I want to set an in point. I don't want to see it until it gets to that. So if I do an option and left bracket, it chops it out. Alternately, I can go to the very beginning and I can drag this forward right here, but that just sets that in point. I don't want this thing to be visible until that exact frame right there. So as this thing plays back, it lights up, nothing's happening, and then at 4 frames and 10 seconds, my actual text appears. Now, with that scroll text layer, it's still selected. I'm going to press my P button. I want to see the positioning. What I want to do is I want to change this thing. I'm going to change my position property. I want this thing to appear off of there. Now, I can manually type in coordinates. I think that coordinates thing is kind of insane. Like, who would ever work that way? I'm just going to visually align it right to the edge here. So at this point, it's like it's off. And as the animation plays back, I'm going to make it kind of scroll all the way through. So now it's in the black kind of right outside this area here. I think that looks good. And I'm going to click that stopwatch because this is my initial keyframe. This is my start point, right? Now I'm going to go to the last frame in the clip and I'm going to change it so that it appears all the way to the edge. I'm going to scroll all the way to the end. And now I'm going to change my position. And again, I just have my scroll text still selected. And I'm going to grab this thing. I'm going to leave it straight. And I'm just going to kind of play it through so that it's going to scroll through this area. I'm just trying to make it look as fluid as possible. It looks like it's got like a little bit of a skew effect on it. So what that's going to do now is as this plays back, sign lights up, text starts scrolling through. Now I've got a problem, obviously. Like, it's scrolling through, but it's not matted out at all. There's no area for it. So what I want to do is I want to create something called a track matte, so that I lock this behind a different layer inside the document. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my scroll area layer. And if I check my eyeball on and off, see how it's just that black box? What I want to do is duplicate this. I want to kind of pin this. This is almost like creating a mask. So with that scroll area selected, I'm going to go up to my edit menu and duplicate it. I want to make a second one. Now it's called scroll area 2. And I'm going to drag this thing up in the stack so it's above that scroll text. So I'm going to drag it here. And now it almost acts like an overlay, like a matted area. If you take a look, I got all these different like toggle switches here. And one of them we've used like mode for like blending modes. But here we've got this track matte, and we haven't really played with this yet. And what I want to do is I want to change this, but I'm going to do this on the, not on the scroll area. I'm going to select the scroll text, and I'm going to make it matte to that scroll area too. The one I want is alpha matte. So basically what it's going to do is it's going to treat that area like a mask. So now as I scroll through, it lights up, the glow happens, my text starts sliding across, and it's locked into that track matte area. So far so good, that making sense? Now what I want to do is I want to make sure, and I saw this on a couple of the title cards, that you guys were adding in motion effects or position effects, and that's fine. That's what you should be doing. But let's make sure that as we're applying these things, we're also turning on that motion blur. I want to make sure that as things play back, they're going to be a little bit more fluid. And as I turn on this motion blur here, I can also adjust the settings of the motion blur. So if I go up to my composition and composition settings, I can kind of control the amount of blur. Now under the comp settings, we've only played with this so far, like setting time, frame rates, the pixel dimensions. But if you click on advanced, there's some other settings here. So notice, like for motion blur, I'm going to reduce that shutter angle. I want my shutter angle to be 90 degrees. I want my shutter phase. I'm going to set this to 0. I can control how many samples per frame, sample limiting. So I can adjust this angle and this phasing to make it more or less blur. And that's where you'll control that amount. So mine was set from when I did my demo yesterday. When you guys first do yours won't be. Yours will be a different number. Yours will look way more blurry. Mine is playing back slower, and the reason that I wanted to change the amount was because the slower it plays, the less blur I need. So now if I go in and I'm just gonna deselect and play it back, it lights up. And I don't need a ton of blur on this because it's playing back so slowly. All right, now next thing I want to do is, this is kind of a funky one. This is called the corner pin effect. This is almost like the puppet warp tool. what I'm going to do is I'm going to play around with adjusting and kind of like how this shows up here. I'm going to kind of make this thing look like it's bouncing around a little bit. So what I want to do is I'm going to jump to my 4-second mark. I'm going to select my show title and my starburst layers. I only want to see them though. So what I'm going to do is, and we haven't done this, it's called soloing. What it does is it just shows the areas selected. So it doesn't delete them, they're not gone, it just focuses in on those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to solo the show title and the starburst layers. So now I just see the starburst, now I just see the show title. It basically just hides everything else as I'm working. Now, with the starburst layer selected, that top one, I'm going to go up to my effects menu and then distort and corner pin. So effect, distort, I got this thing called the corner pin. And you see these little like kind of circles light up. And notice that if I take a look down below under my effects controls, I've got these upper left, upper right, lower left, lower right. I've got all these kind of position points, and you'll see they're all tied to those little pins. So what I could do is, if I wanted to zoom in a little bit on this area, grab my hand tool and center a little bit more. Now what I can do is I'm going to set an initial start point for all these. So this is my first keyframe, right? Now what I'm going to do is, this is my start. At the 6-second mark, I'm going to drag over, and I'm going to start playing around with these positions. So what I could do is I could manually punch in numbers here, or I can just click on these points. And adjust them, and I'll go back to my 8-second mark, and I'm just going to kind of play around with these things. So now if you take a look, it's going to kind of give a little of a effect to that. And you can drag those in any direction you want. It's just the idea that they're kind of tilting and playing around with emphasis or with the perspective of it. So it's a real kind of easy way of doing that. Now what I can do is I can unsolo these. I can see the whole animation. And let me zoom back out. I'm going to just fit this thing right inside the screen. And I want to deselect everything so nothing's showing. And now if I play it back, here's my lights. Let's play it back slow because I haven't rendered. And then as my text starts sliding in, I'm seeing my animation play back. So far so good, makes sense? All right, now, next thing I want to take a look at here is, let me jump back in. There we go. Sorry about that. All right, next thing I want to take a look at is playing around with creating a mask. I want to make it look like as these lights come up that the sky in the background gets darker. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to actually build a mask, and we're going to do it with the pen tool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back to my start point. I'm going to select my lit marquee layer. That's this one right here. Notice I have the lit and then the unlit. I'm going to select this lit one. I'm going to duplicate that. So I'll go to Edit, Duplicate. I want a copy of it. I got this lit marquee too. And I'm going to grab the pen tool, and with this lit marquee 2 selected, what I want to do is I'm going to draw out an area around the outside of this thing so that all this kind of like outside world, not the lights, not anything else, but just kind of that outside world, that this, we can apply a mask to it and actually darken it. So what I'm going to do is with my pen tool, and I can work off the canvas with this, so I'm going to kind of start like down here. And I'm just going to do a rough one just for the sake of time, but obviously you can go a little bit slower with yours. You can kind of go in, and you need to adjust obviously all this tools like the convert points. I can add on extra points. I'm going to go across the top here, back from my pen tool. Zoom out just a little bit. Make sure I'm grabbing my back over. Just jump across here. And I need to make this one big area, so I'm going to come up and over and basically create a mask around the outline of this. So I'll connect this. This is one big completed path. Refit this back to the screen. So now I've got this area that's all drawn as one big kind of piece here, right? Now, obviously, I'd go in and clean mine up with my direct selection tool, but I'm not super worried about that right now. I'm just going to kind of to move a little bit more quickly through it. I think this will be okay for right now. So now I've got this thing drawn, right? It's all selected and it's on that lit marquee 2 layer. What we're going to do is we're going to add it in a solid layer. So what I want to do is I want to make a new solid and I want to mask that solid onto this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my lit marquee, grab my selection tool, hit the lit marquee. Now with that thing selected, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my layer menu and I want to add in a new solid background. So I'll go into layer, new, solid. And for this, I'm going to just select like a nice dark black or like a nice dark gray color. So here, something like that. That looks good. Dark gray, click OK. That looks good. And I want to make sure that I make this thing the comp size. I'll click OK. So basically what it does is it just creates that as a new darkened layer, and I see it in the background. It's appearing behind everything else. All right, now, next thing I want to do, with this dark gray layer, I've got this built in, it's selected. I'm going to select that lit marquee 2. And what I want to do is I want to make this thing a mask. So I'm going to press M. And if I'm not seeing mask, that's how I do it. So just like how we shortcut with other things, now I can mask to this. And what I want to do is underneath my settings here, I'm going to change my mode to darken. And I'm going to use this inverted. I want, right now it's selecting everything outside. I want everything inside that area. I'm going to select that inverted option. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to that dark gray solid layer. And on this thing, I'm going to press T. I want to see the opacity of it. And I want to go set at the very beginning. I want this to be 0. I don't want to see this at all. So again, got my opacity. I'm going to turn on my little clock to set this. I'm going to reset this to 0. I don't want to see it at all, right? Now what I want to do is I'm going to slowly fade this in. So I'm going to jump to about the 1 second and 23 frame mark, jump to about here, and I'm going to set this to about 5%. So it kind of darkens in. And then at 409, right here, like right before my text starts rolling in, I'm going to click the add or remove keyframe button. So this one right here. So I'm going to add another keyframe. And on this keyframe, I'm going to bump this thing up to about 75%. You can see how it's really darkening up that background. And you can see also too where my mask was slightly off. It's only going to darken that. So clearly I need to clean up my mask lines a little bit. And now if I take a look and come back to the beginning, now as the lights kick in, it starts darkening as all my effects start happening. It kind of gives me that appearance at night. Now obviously, like, I can go back at any point and on my lit marquee, this isn't going to affect the animation. This is just going to affect the point. I can click on it once. It acts like a direct select tool. I can kind of clean that line up. Here I can kind of clean. I'll click away and deselect. Grab this line and kind of clean that up. So obviously I'll kind of leave that up to you guys to play around with that as you build your masks. But now as I go through, now my edge is a little bit better. So I can jump back to the beginning, deselect everything. I'm going to collapse all these options now. And then I can go ahead and play back my animation. So everything's lightening, it's lightening up, starting to darken. And my text starts flying through. So I think like the big idea with this is that what you can do with masking I think is really important here, because it's going to allow you to kind of work with these existing layers within a document, but you can also pull up other pieces. So if you're going to add in additional layers, you can kind of do that. Now, last thing I want to take a look at is this time remap thing. I kind of had some funky results with this. It's not something I've used a ton of, but I'm gonna kind of walk you guys through just so you can get a general idea of what it is I'm talking about. But what I want to do is I want to play around with retiming this thing so we can kind of play around with like sequencing and how things happen. So like if we wanted to add on like a reverse or a forward, basically the idea is that it's almost like a time lapse, but it gives you more than one way to play with time. So the idea of time mapping is that you can speed up or slow down or stop or reverse footage without having to reanimate the whole thing. And that's really the big idea with it. So what I want to do first is I'm going to grab that marquee composition in our project panel. So let me click back to my project. So here's our marquee comp, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this thing. So I got this thing selected. I'm going to go to my edit menu and duplicate it. It's just going to be called marquee 2. And it's going to show up in our project panel. And I'm going to double click this thing and pull it open so that now I have a secondary timeline. I have a secondary project that's pulled open, right? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my starburst layer and I'm going to shift click down all the way to the bottom to the lit marquee. I want to grab all of it, excuse me, to the unlit marquee. Make sure I get the whole thing. I can expand up if I want to see all of my layers within it. Now with all of them selected, I'm going to go to my layer menu and I'm going to pre-compose these. And what I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm moving all these into a new composition. So that's the idea, is I'm taking all this stuff, collecting it, and putting it into a new comp. And I'm just going to leave it as a default name, call it pre-composition 1. Now, what that basically does is it almost makes this thing act like a flattened layer. So now I'm not going to be affecting these things individually. They're all pre-comped into one big layer, so I can play with overall effects. So almost think of this as like flattening layers. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my layer menu, and then I have this time option here. And notice I have this thing called Enable Time Remapping. That's going to allow me to play around with my sequencing. Now, After Effects adds in 2 keyframes here. You see this? The first and the last at the very beginning. And a time remap property also appears underneath that layer name here. So now this shows up. And it's letting me control which frame is displayed at any given point, right? So with this pre-comp layer 1 active, I'm going to go up to my layer menu and tell it to open layer. And now it's showing me this weird little like timing thing along the bottom. And that's going to open up those controls for it. There's a couple different ways that we can look at this panel. But what I can do is I can kind of play around to preview how this looks, see what my source time looks like. And it's going to follow all the same stuff that we built. Lights come on, they start to darken, my text scrolls through, and my animation happens. What I want to do is I want to take a look at the first 4 seconds. They come on, those lights come on slowly. I want to speed that up so they come on twice as fast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remap these values. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go to the 2-second mark. So drag this here. And I got this remap. So here I can adjust where these points sit by remapping the time here. So here, see how it's the source time and then the playback time, how it's going to remap this thing. And notice it adds these frames in, and I can adjust these frames if I want to speed up any of these points or adjust any of them, right? Now, there's a couple different ways you can do this. There's this, which is one way. There's also this graph editor. So if you click on this thing, notice that when we created these points, how it just starts putting these in here. I can start playing around with these points to remap it this way. So I can start adjusting. So if I wanted like lights to flicker, things to come on, things to happen, and then stop. And I can add in points with different keyframes. So here, I can edit those selected keyframes. I can play around with my ramp. So if I wanted things to happen quickly or slowly, I have these additional points, so I can adjust these. Here, if I wanted to like blend this in a little bit more and how fast it happens, I've got this right here. I can convert this. So now I can do an auto Bezier. I can kind of ease it in and ease it out. So here, as the effects come in, they flicker in, and then time goes backwards and it kicks forward again. So here, maybe I'll come in like this. Maybe I'll just do it a little bit over. So So I can kind of play around with these remaps and how things sequence out. So basically this is going to allow me to kind of play around with timing and adjustments on overall. Again, you can see like it does kind of some funky stuff. It's just a way of playing around with timing without having to reanimate everything. So it's one way of playing around with it. Honestly, I've not had super success with this thing just because it's been real, like it's just kind of finicky. And for the most part, like I tend to think of things as a very linear mode when I'm doing all this timeline-based animation. So when I'm doing timeline work, I'm just going to think about it in terms of like start to finish, how it's going to work. This is not a requirement for the project. I just wanted to show you that this is like a feature that's in there. It definitely does require a little bit of playing around with and just adjusting some of the tools. But if you want to mess around with it, that's totally fine. Now, the last thing I want to take a look at before we wrap this up is just a saving option. I know that we've been having some issues with exporting, or some people have. If you haven't been outputting with Adobe Media Encoder, that's this right here. You should have it installed just because that's all part of the process. I'm going to pull open Adobe Media Encoder. I wanted to show you guys a couple things. This might be helpful with exporting out your work from these projects, reducing file sizes, and also for the next project that we're going to do, being able to create something that's a little bit more shareable and not something like, I know some people have been generating like these project files as QuickTime movies that are like a gig, just way too big. We don't need it. So I'm going to fire up in Media Encoder. I want to have that queue open, and I'm going to, before I go too far, I'm going to save this thing. I'm just going to throw this on the desktop. Name quick. Now, rather than outputting this thing just through my file, export, add to render queue, and doing it that way, what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to add this thing into my Adobe Media Encoder queue so I can check the settings here. Now, when I add something into the encoder queue, it's going to pop up here. I can set up a couple different spots. I can set up from my desktop. And there it is. It took just a second for it to show up. And what it's going to do is it's going to ask me what I want to save this thing out as. So the first option here, this is your format. And I definitely had an issue where it took a second to check the link server. The first thing is format, and what I want to do is I want to make sure that I can see what all my options are. So here, there's all these different pull downs. H.264 is the best compression standard that you can get. This is what I tend to use everything for, like especially when I'm uploading to YouTube. It looks great and creates the smallest file sizes. So I always recommend using H.264 no matter what you're encoding for. Also notice there's presets. So for whatever device, whatever type of application, Twitter, Facebook, Vimeo, YouTube, it's all in there. For this, if you just want to output high qualities, if you know, there's all the way up to 4K. So I just did mine as a 720. The nice part about this too is that as you're selecting this thing, it's going to give you a little bit of some preview information. Like right now, it's estimating my file size at 12 meg. That's totally usable, way easier. But again, if you want to change any of your settings, that's where you can kind of control all this. Yes, I want to export video and audio, so that looks good. Again, so I'm changing the settings here underneath the preset. I can double check it. And then this output file, it's going to save this thing as Marquee 2 as an MP4 file right on the desktop. That's perfect. So all I need to do is hit play to start this queue. It renders this thing out. And obviously my size was funky on this. If I wanted to, I could go into my comp settings and reset my size and reset my canvas, but this is good enough for right now. It encodes pretty quickly too. I mean, obviously it's only a 10-second clip, but it's not doing super high res stuff. So close all this. And on my desktop, there's an AME, this Adobe Media Encoder. There's the actual MP4 file. If I double click this thing, it's only 6.5 meg. There's my weird time playback. And this is an emailable file. So if you haven't been using Adobe Media Encoder or you've been running into any issues, I recommend using that going forward. I think it's just going to be much easier. You're going to email me a finished version. I prefer MP4s. You can just throw them right in emails. If you do have any issues with anything and you want to throw them in Google Drive links, either way that works for me, but just kind of your preference. But I think that that's probably the easiest way for everybody to work. So any questions on that? Anything jumping out, you guys? Cool. All right, so that's what you're gonna be working on this week. And then the second thing we're gonna be taking a look at is project number 2. So if you guys click underneath the projects panel, there's now a new one open. It's called Kinetic Type. And I want to review the project requirements. I have a submission folder that you're going to upload everything into. I have an example, I have a converter point, and I have some tutorial stuff. So we'll kind of walk through these from top to bottom. So first thing, if you're going to click on that Kinetic type project requirements, the big idea for this is you're going to create a 30-second video that's going to focus on creating lyrics that are synced up alongside the corresponding imagery or video for a song of your choice. So if you wanted to take an original video from whatever artist, there's some great tools. I'll show you guys one that you can actually like pull those audio or video clips off of YouTube. And add in layers with text and animated text and some options with it. I have a really cool example that I'll kind of show you. That's really what you're going to be doing. And you don't need to do the entire song. You just need to do 30 seconds worth of that clip. Now, as far as requirements, your final clip, again, will be 30 seconds, song of your choice. For file setup, this will be a 1920 by 1080, 29 frames per second. You'll need a minimum of 2 video clips used. Your type will be sequenced up to the clip. There are effects applied to all your type clips, and you'll need at least 3 additional image assets or video are also usable. As far as how you're going to be graded on this thing, it's a standard. The aesthetics of how it looks, the technical of how it's built, that it's got all the correct submission, and then as far as like a presentation or critique, what I do want to do is take a little bit of time with these. That first run, they were only kind of 10 seconds long. These tend to be a little bit cooler, tend to be a little bit more like fun and engaging. So what we'll plan on doing is, just like we did last time, we're going to take the first week for you guys to get the basics put together. Next week, we're going to do a check-in so you guys can kind of present where you're at and kind of ask questions as you have them. And then I think what we'll do is we'll plan on these things being due in 2 weeks. It's the 17th, and we don't have class. So these will be due that following Wednesday, I'm sorry, the 16th. We do have class, but I'm going to give you guys that as a week off. And then the following week, that's when this will be due, which I believe is the 23rd. And I'll have all that updated on the announcements page. So far, any questions about the basics? And here's all the requirements. And again, it's pretty straightforward. I leave a lot of this open-ended just so you guys can kind of play in After Effects and get comfortable with it. There is a submission folder where you're going to drop these things. The main reason I want these in a submission folder is so that we can kind of use this as a SharePoint to check out each other's, especially when we do the critiques, so that everybody can kind of pull open each other's. Playback tends to be a little bit spotty or a little bit funky when we're taking a look at Collaborate, so I want you guys to be able to open them in real time on your end. So if you take a look, you'll submit the MP4 in the main folder, and then you'll create a new subfolder for all your assets. So right now there's nothing in here, but again, you'll drop in your MP4 that you'll present, and we'll be able to watch just with our QuickTime players, and then a folder labeled with your name that has your After Effects project file and all your support assets inside of it. That makes sense for submission? All right, so what I want to do is take a look. Here's an example. You're not going to be able to hear this because of how playback works, but if you take a look, this is absolutely built in After Effects. You can see how kind of like the background video is set, the way the text kind of runs. If you want to take a look at the actual video and kind of like hear the music along with it, obviously the link is right there for you, but this is the general idea of what you're doing. So here, like there's a couple different video clips. There's effects applied to the one, multiple objects like images. We're going to take a look at chroma keying, how this background is knocked out. We'll get to a point like that. Some line reveals, some rotation, just some pretty basic stuff, like nothing super crazy, but it's giving me a chance to play around sequencing and timing. So that's the example that's available to you guys. I have this link here. It's this YouTube to Mp3 Mp4 converter. This thing works awesome. What you can do is you can just grab a clip. So if I grab, say, this right here, and this is just the original, like the non-lyric version, and say I wanted to do that as mine, I could drop it in here. I could paste this link in, and I select whether I want it as a song, as an MP3, or as a video, as an MP4. I just hit converts. It checks it, it loads it, it processes it, and then it just gives you a download option. You can throw it into a Dropbox. I'm just going to download. Just want to throw it right on my computer. And there's my MP3 ready to go. So it just strips the audio right out of the YouTube file, and then you can drag that right into your After Effects project. Just again, remember that audio acts like any other asset. So what you can do is if you're going to use any video that you're going to use from those open source free asset pieces, any of the royalty-free stuff. If there's any video you're going to find in there, that's cool. If you're going to use original video from it, if you want to pull just the MP3 and you're going to create your own backgrounds, your own stuff, this is totally up to you guys. Again, like I want to leave this very open-ended just so you can play around with it and get a little bit more comfortable with it. Obviously, like building something like this that was 3.5 minutes long is going to be a lot more. So I just want those 30 seconds of it. Again, it's just kind of like a warm-up to getting used to editing and kind of playing a little bit more with syncing and getting a little more comfortable with working with the software. Same idea works here. If you want to set something as an MP4, you can also grab MP4 versions, but you'll need to reprocess it. So if you reload the page, I can paste it in here, select MP4, convert it out, and it's going to run through just the same. Last link I had on here, and there was a couple of different ways of doing this, so I didn't want to like just throw this at you like in a very generic way. I wanted to kind of show you a couple different techniques you could try and employ. If you take a look at this bottom one, it says technique tutorials. There's a bunch of different ways. I saw this one because they were kind of great walkthroughs. It's kind of like food for thought stuff. So if you take a look, there's very specific walkthroughs that actually show you like how to do it in After Effects, different ways of setting up your layers, playing with syncing and timing, different effects you can do with it. They just kind of give you a couple different visual ideas of how these can look. These all tend to run between like 16 and 20 minutes long. But the other thing you can consider too is just kind of messing around with like sequencing, timing, seeing how it looks, getting an idea for styling, that type of thing. So again, this is just kind of like a start point. But there's a couple different ways of doing it. Some revealing, some hand lettering stuff, just a couple different options for how to kind of bounce yours across. Cool. Anything jumping out you guys as far as questions go before we wrap up?
No.
That's it. All right, cool. Well, then what we'll plan on doing next week is we're going to jump into the next lesson of the book. We're going to do a little bit more stuff with masking. So we'll take a look at a lesson on masking, and then I'm going to leave it as just kind of open lab time for you guys to present what you got so far and ask questions if you have any on your lyric video or your kinetic type projects. And then the following week, I'm going to have a pre-recorded demo, and then the week after that will just be submission time for your kinetic type projects. So I'm going to kill the recording and then just hang out if anybody's got any questions or if they just want to work through this and have me on the line in case they run into any issues so I can answer it for them. So that's all I got for you guys for this week. Thank you.
All right.